It is the winter of 1913. Carl Jung is 38 years old, at the height of his reputation, one of the most respected psychiatrists in Europe, heir apparent to Sigmund Freud's entire legacy, and he is sitting alone at his desk, by candlelight, writing in a red leather book, not clinical notes, not academic papers, something stranger. He is writing conversations, actual written dialogues, with figures that appeared to him in waking visions. A wise old man named Philemon, a serpent woman named Salome. Voices that he could hear clearly, as distinct from his own thinking as a stranger's voice across a quiet room. He would later call this period his confrontation with the unconscious. His colleagues would have called it something else entirely, but Jung made a choice that very few people in his position would ever make. He chose not to silence what was rising inside him, he chose to listen. And sitting at the edge of Lake Zurich, on the days when the visions were too vivid for his study, he did something that must have looked to any passerby completely inexplicable. He sat down in the dirt beside the water, picked up stones, and built small towers with his children. He played. A world-famous psychiatrist, deliberately dismantling the architecture of his professional identity to make room for something he could not yet name. That something had a name. He would spend the rest of his life finding it, and the name, the process, is what we're here to explore together today. Before we go deeper, think about this. Is there a version of yourself that you only show to certain people or in certain moments? Tell me in the comments, where do you feel most like yourself? And if this kind of exploration is what you come here for. Like this video and subscribe. We go into these depths every week, and I don't want you to miss what's coming next. Here is the question that no one quite asks out loud, but that almost everyone carries. What if the person you've been all this time isn't actually you? Not a dramatic statement, not an accusation, just what if the self you've been presenting, defending, perfecting, performing, what if it was never quite the real thing? What if somewhere under all of that, there is a person who has been waiting patiently and sometimes not so patiently for their turn to exist? You haven't been living your life. You've been performing it, and somewhere deep inside you already know that. This is not a comfortable place to stand. But it is, I would argue, the most honest place a human being can occupy, and it's exactly where Jung decided to build his most important work. Jung called the process of becoming who you actually are individuation. The word comes from the Latin individuus, indivisible, whole. But the way Jung used it, it wasn't a description of what we already are. It was a description of what we are capable of becoming if we're willing to do the work. At its core, individuation is the lifelong process, through which the self, the deepest organizing center of the psyche, gradually emerges from beneath the accumulated layers of what we were taught to be. It is not a philosophical concept. It is not a spiritual aspiration. For Jung, it was as real and as urgent as any clinical condition he treated, because its absence was, in his view, the source of much of the suffering he witnessed in his consulting room. To understand why, you need to understand three things Jung mapped in the psyche, not as metaphors, but as functional structures with real consequences: the persona, the shadow, and the ego. The ego is what we normally call I, the center of conscious identity, the one who wakes up in the morning, knows its name, has preferences and opinions and plans. The persona is the mask, or more precisely, the collection of masks that the ego wears when it engages with the world. The professional self, the social self, the self that is appropriate, competent, acceptable. The persona is not a lie. It is a necessary translation between the inner world and the outer one. The shadow is everything that didn't make the cut, the impulses, desires, qualities, and truths that were too uncomfortable, too inconvenient, or too threatening to integrate into the persona. They didn't disappear. They went underground. And from underground, they operate in moods we can't explain, in reactions we're ashamed of, in the things we despise most violently in other people. Individuation is the process through which all of this, persona, shadow, ego, and the deeper self beneath them, begins to move toward integration. Not fusion, not the erasure of all tension, but a new relationship, one in which the whole person, including the parts that were never invited to the table, begins to participate in the life being lived. Most people, for most of their lives, live almost entirely in the persona. And this is not a failure. It's a survival strategy. It's what we learned to do early when the stakes were real, when being loved, accepted, or safe required us to emphasize certain things about ourselves and suppress others. Think about the child who discovers early that anger is not safe in her family. She doesn't decide to stop feeling angry. She decides, below the level of conscious decision, to stop showing anger, then to stop naming it, then eventually to stop recognizing it in herself at all. By the time she is an adult, she would describe herself as someone who is just, not an angry person, and she would be telling the truth as far as she could see. But the anger would still be there. It would appear as chronic overwork or as biting sarcasm she calls just being direct, or as a specific disproportionate irritation she feels toward people who express emotion freely. The persona calcifies. What was once flexible, a tool for navigating the world, becomes a second skeleton. And the person inside it stops growing, not because they don't want to, but because the shell no longer has room for more. Here is what makes this so insidious. The persona that calcifies around us is often genuinely admirable. It's functional. It produces results. Other people validate it. Your career rewards it. Your relationships depend on it. And so the signal that something is wrong doesn't come as an obvious alarm. It comes as a kind of flatness, a sense that you are very good at your life and somehow absent from it, that you are performing competence without experiencing aliveness, that you can explain yourself perfectly to anyone who asks, and that explanation feels completely accurate and somehow hollow. Most people spend their entire lives becoming better at being someone they never chose to be. Before we continue, I want to pause here for a moment. Everything we're exploring in this video, I know it can awaken something in you, a desire to go deeper than what any single video can offer. I've been in that place too, where the ideas begin to crack something open, and suddenly information isn't enough. What you need is a framework, structure, a way to actually work with what's being surfaced rather than just think about it. If that's where you are right now, there's a link in the description below. Take a look when the video ends. Now let's keep going. Here is what Jung understood, and what most people miss until life forces them to see it. The persona doesn't crack because you decide to do personal growth. It cracks because something happens, something that the carefully constructed self cannot absorb, process, or explain away. A relationship ends. Not because anyone did anything obviously wrong, but because both people slowly became strangers inside the roles they were playing. A career succeeds magnificently and somehow produces only emptiness, a diagnosis, a loss, a sudden inexplicable inability to keep doing the thing you have always done, the way you have always done it, a depression with no visible cause that makes no sense, given how well your life looks from the outside. The moment your life stops making sense is not a sign that you're broken. It's a sign that something real is trying to surface. These moments feel like failure. We are trained to experience them as failure, as evidence that we weren't strong enough or consistent enough or resilient enough to hold it together. But Jung saw them differently. He saw them as moments when the self, that deeper organizing intelligence that has been patient for years, finally finds a crack in the wall large enough to send something through. The crisis is not the problem. The crisis is the communication. This is perhaps the hardest reframe in all of depth psychology, and I don't offer it lightly, because the pain of these moments is real. The disorientation is real. The grief for the self that was, the life that seemed stable, the identity that crumbled, all of it is real. But underneath that grief, if you can bear to go there, there is frequently something else, relief, a small, terrible, unmistakable relief, as if some part of you has been holding its breath for a very long time, and finally, something honest has happened. The crisis you're trying to survive might be the most honest thing that's ever happened to you. Now we get to the part that most people misunderstand, even those who have spent time with Jungian ideas. The part that sounds on the surface like it might mean destroy your ego, tear down everything you've built, abandon your identity and become a blank canvas. It doesn't mean any of that. What the individuation process requires is not the destruction of the ego. It requires the relativization of the ego. There is a profound difference. A relativized ego still functions. It still makes decisions, maintains relationships, navigates professional life, but it no longer believes it is the whole story. It no longer confuses itself with the self. It becomes, in Jung's language, a servant of the self rather than a tyrant over it. Jung described a principle he called enantiodromia, a Greek term he borrowed from the philosopher Heraclitus, meaning the tendency of things to turn into their opposites. In nature, the principle is visible everywhere. Excessive heat produces cold, extreme order generates chaos, prolonged drought precedes flood. In the psyche, the same dynamic operates. The more completely we identify with one pole of our nature, the responsible one, the strong one, the rational one, the more powerfully its opposite builds pressure in the unconscious. This is why the most controlled people sometimes erupt with devastating precision, why the most devoted caregivers sometimes collapse into complete unavailability, why the person who has never been depressed a day in their life sometimes falls apart in ways that seem to come from nowhere and leave everyone baffled. It doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from everywhere they refuse to go. The goal of individuation is not to eliminate this tension. The tension is generative. It is, in a sense, the engine. The goal is to develop a relationship with both poles, to hold the opposites consciously with enough inner spaciousness that neither has to seize control by force. The ego learns that it is not the center of the universe, and in that learning, paradoxically, it becomes more itself. Let me offer you an image that I find more useful than any diagram or definition. Think of an oak tree, not the full, tall oak that you might picture, but the seed, small, dense, complete. Inside that seed, everything the oak will ever become is already present. The architecture of the branches, the particular way the bark will grain, the depth the roots will eventually reach, all of it already encoded. Now, the seed has a casing, a shell, hard, protective, necessary. Without that shell, the seed would not have survived the winter, the transit, the time underground, before conditions were right for growth. The shell was not an accident. It was not the enemy. It was the reason the seed made it this far. But there is a moment, not a decision, but a moment, when the shell cracks, when the internal pressure of what the seed is becoming exceeds the structural capacity of what protected it. And in that cracking, what was preserved inside begins for the first time to actually grow. The persona is the shell. The individuation is the cracking. The shell was not a mistake. It protected something real and valuable while conditions were not yet right for full growth. Honor it for that. But if the shell never cracks, if it is maintained at all costs, reinforced every time it shows weakness, defended against every force that might cause it to give, then the oak dies inside it, perfectly preserved, completely empty, structurally flawless and biologically hollow. What Jung was doing at the edge of Lake Zurich, building towers of stone in the dirt, was not regression. It was not a breakdown. It was a man allowing his shell to crack, deliberately, consciously, with full awareness of what it might cost him, because he understood that what was trying to grow inside him was more important than the structure that had contained it. If you've stayed with me this far, I think you can feel what this material is asking of you, and I want to honor that by being honest. Going deeper with this isn't always comfortable to do alone. The link in the description is there for when the ideas aren't enough anymore. When you're ready for a framework to actually work with what's been activated. I've shared it with people who were exactly where you might be right now. Take a look when you're done here. And if this video is opening something for you, subscribe, leave a like. It genuinely helps more people find this work. Now, let's finish this properly. Here's what I want to leave you with. And I genuinely want to hear your answer. What's one thing about yourself that you've been postponing becoming? Write it below. Not for me, for you. So how do you know if the individuation process is already underway in your life? Not the version you've been consciously pursuing, the version that's happening whether or not you signed up for it. There are 4 marks that tend to appear, not as grand revelations, but as quiet, persistent disruptions in the texture of ordinary life. The first is a growing dissonance between your external life and your inner experience. Everything looks right from the outside. Stable, functional, even admirable. But there is a private gap. A sense that the person living this life and the person inside the person living it are not quite the same entity. You perform your life convincingly, and you know you're performing it. This isn't depression. It isn't ingratitude. It is the self beginning to differentiate itself from the roles you've been playing. The second is a shift in what triggers you. The things that used to provoke strong emotional reactions in you begin to change. Not because you've worked through them, but because new things are surfacing. You find yourself unexpectedly moved by something you would have dismissed before, or unexpectedly furious at something that seems too small to justify the reaction. These are not signs of instability. They are the edges of the shadow beginning to become visible. The third is a change in your relationship to solitude. People undergoing individuation frequently discover that they need more time alone, not to escape, but to hear something that cannot be heard over the noise of social performance. There is a quality of listening in this solitude that is different from loneliness or withdrawal. It feels, on good days, like being in the presence of something that knows you better than you know yourself. The fourth is a specific kind of fatigue, not tiredness from overwork, though that may also be present. A deeper fatigue, with the maintenance of images that no longer feel true. The exhaustion of holding the shape of a self that has outgrown its container. This fatigue is often mistaken for burnout, for midlife crisis, for spiritual dryness. It can be any of those things. But it is also frequently the first sign that something is asking to be put down. If you recognize any of these, more than one perhaps, I am not telling you something is wrong. I am telling you something is working. There is one more thing I want to address, because the confusion around it causes real harm. Individuation is not the same as self-absorption. It is not permission to become difficult, isolated, or indifferent to the people around you. It is not the same as following every impulse and calling it authenticity. And it is most certainly not the same as dismantling every relationship, responsibility, or commitment in the name of becoming yourself. Jung was explicit about this. Individuation does not unfold in a vacuum. It unfolds through relationship, through the friction, the love, the confrontation, the failure, and the repair that only happens in genuine contact with other people. The individuating person does not withdraw from the world. They engage with it more honestly. What falls away in individuation is not connection. It is false connection. The relationships you maintained purely out of obligation without genuine feeling. The agreements you made with your own future that were really capitulations to someone else's fear. The version of yourself that was likable, manageable, and safe, and that required a constant effort to sustain. What remains, and this is not a small thing, is what was actually real. Individuation doesn't ask you to become someone new. It asks you to stop pretending you're not already someone. And perhaps this is the most important distinction of all. Becoming who you actually are does not make you less available to others. It makes you more available to them because for the first time, it is actually you who shows up. Not a role, not a defense, not a carefully calibrated performance of acceptability. You, with all the complexity and contradiction and particular strange beauty that implies. Let me take you back to the lake. It is still 1913. Jung is sitting at the edge of the water. His career is uncertain. His relationship with Freud, the closest intellectual father he had, is finished. The voices in his head would alarm most people, and they alarmed him too. He did not know what he was doing. He did not know what was coming. But he picked up the stones anyway. He built the towers anyway. He sat with the discomfort of not knowing who he was becoming long enough to find out. He would later write, and this is a paraphrase because the original German resists clean translation, that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. That the greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parent. That what is not made conscious will appear as fate. He was not describing philosophy. He was describing a process he had lived through, imperfectly, painfully, without guarantee, and that had produced something the academic career alone could never have given him. A self that was actually his. Jung didn't discover the unconscious by studying others. He found it by refusing to look away from himself. And so I want to leave you with the same image I opened with. Jung at the edge of the lake, the stone in his hand, the towers taking shape, the silence of a man who has stopped performing and started listening. This is what individuation looks like before it is anything else. A pause, a willingness to sit in the space between who you were told to be and who you are actually becoming. A decision, not dramatic, not permanent, but real, to stop running from the question you've been carrying. The question is not, who should I be? The question is simpler and much harder than that. The question is, who am I? Not who were you shaped into? Not who do people need you to be? Not who you would be if your fears were smaller or your wounds were fewer. Who are you? That question is the beginning, and if you're asking it genuinely not as an exercise, but as something that keeps you awake, then the process has already started. With or without your permission, exactly as it's supposed to, the oak doesn't decide to crack the shell. The shell cracks because the oak is ready. I think you might be ready. If this conversation opens something in you, something you want to sit with longer or take somewhere deeper. The next video in this series is already there. I'd love for you to continue this with me. The link is in the description and the work doesn't stop here. It's just beginning.